So congratulations, if you followed along, you've created your own version of our artwork here, which is looking very attractive, and you'll have it in a vector format. I won't show you how to save out a vector file from Illustrator because there's already so many guides showing you how to do that. But this will just be a few tips and some usage guidelines that are specific to detailed logos such as the one we've created. So as always, this is for a client. With your own portfolio piece, of course, you can skip some of these steps. But for a client, you've got to make sure they have a vector file, as we mentioned. And if you do decide you want to give them something they can use with this kind of finishing effect, make sure the background, this is quite nice, but make sure they have it on a range of backgrounds, and make sure they have it transparently in case they need to use it on web, perhaps the header of a website. Just make sure you've given it to them in a way that's going to meet their needs. So as I showed in an earlier video, there's a way of making sure this it works nicely on a black background. We looked at making some tweaks and adjustments, taking off a shadow so it works on a white background. And if you've used a different PSD to create a mock-up, just make sure your client understands this is kind of a hero version of the logo. It's something they could use maybe on promotional material, but they do need a living, breathing vector file that they'll be able to use on letterheads, for example. What happens when they need to create invoices and use the logo? Well, if all you'd created was something like this, that's really not going to cut it. So that's a really important consideration. Then in terms of usage, and this should happen earlier on in the process, but definitely before you finalize, you need to make sure, and we really hammered this out in the second lesson, that it's fit for purpose, in that when you zoom out, it has to be clearly legible. So I'm showing this pretty small on the screen at the moment, and to me the M is very clear. The brand name itself, and even the tagline, at the moment on my screen I can read that quite clearly. So you need to perform those checks. Just make sure it's performing at a minimum size. And if you're creating brand guidelines for your client, test it and then let them know what the minimum size is they need to use it at. Now, there may be a situation where you recommend, for example, the avatar on social media, that they just use, perhaps you could say in the guidelines, just use this, use the brand mark. Don't try to fit the whole logo in because you're going to be sacrificing legibility. Or there may be situations where, you say just use the logo type by itself and omit the brand mark. But just make sure you consider those situations and clearly outline to your client how to use the logo, and don't let them use it, perhaps put it on a letterhead at a very small size and then have to come back to you and say, well, I can't read the tagline. Make sure you've kind of considered these things first and you let your client know, you educate them on how to use this. One last thing we'll just mention, if you've created different versions of this yourself, or perhaps you play with it, you've created a different composition, a test you'll need to do to make sure it works, it's fit for purpose. How does the logo look if you delete the unnecessary detail? Does it still work? Could you still identify the brand? Now, obviously, you don't want to provide this as an option to your client. You don't want to provide a version without the detail, but it just illustrates the point. It's adding something extra, it's enriching the brand, but your brand isn't relying on someone being able to see perhaps a certain shape in this decorative pattern we've used here. And if it's an extra nod, if it's that extra kind of onion skin layer of detail, then that's brilliant. But just make sure the brand is strong enough with without those elements being, being clear and being taken in by a client. Because that way, and we'll zoom out again, if it's at this kind of size, you can't expect someone to either be able to read this secondary tagline or to be able to make out what the detail is. But they get the idea. There's still a sense of this very opulent, detailed logo. And in fact, it makes someone want to look a little closer. And I think that's always a good thing for a logo to draw the eye. So those are just some final considerations. Otherwise, you're good to go in either using this logo yourself or beginning to supply it to your client.